Hey there, friends. As most of you know, we still don't have the manifesto of the Nashville trans shooter who shot these 6 innocent people at the Christian school a couple of months ago. Still don't have that. A lot of litigation going on. Parents, I think, of the shooter somehow or another are awarding the manifesto to the parents of the victims. So there's some kind of a transition there. There's lawsuits that say that this needs to be released as soon as possible because it's a freedom of information issue now. So I think we might see a really heavily redacted, probably something that is as black as this when we get to it, because it'll be so heavily redacted because they're scared of what we'll see. However, they have released the autopsy report and the full-blown toxicology report. Now, real quick, I'm going to go through a couple of these things just to show you the obvious of what we already know and some things that are kind of surprising. First of all, here's your main cover page from the Office of the Medical Examiner. And they talk about what happened, the situation that happened down below in the paragraph listed under narrative. We go through here and they talk about the bullet wounds that the trans person got whenever law enforcement shot them. There were apparently 3 bullet wounds and 1 grazing, I believe. From what they're saying here, that bullet A went into the torso and the left arm, the same bullet did. B went into the head. C was a superficial wound of the right shoulder. I think that was just where it was grazed. And the number 4 was another bullet hole that went through the right thigh. So number 3 there was what they're calling just a grazed bullet wound. It did not actually enter the body. So you can see where each of the bullet holes, again, impacted the body. I did find it a little bit, not really newsworthy, because I think all of us knew, but this trans person was, in fact, clinically declared a woman, as you can see right here. The body is that of a well-developed, well-nourished, 5 foot 2 inch, 119.5 pound phenotypic female who appears to be the reported age of 28 years old. I also noticed that whenever they had their list of report of all the internal organs and everything external, they did list that the external genitalia consist of an adult atraumatic vulva. The anus is unremarkable. I hope whenever I die that they also list that my anus is unremarkable. And again, at the very end for the summary, they once again clarify, but almost reluctantly, that this was in fact a female and not the male that she wanted to be. The decedent is a 28-year-old assigned female at birth, reluctantly really don't want to talk about that. Reported transgender person who was identified by law enforcement as Audrey Hale and who was also known as Aiden. And of course, the drawing appears to be that of a physically enabled and equipped woman as well. So clearly there was no, quote, bottom surgery or anything else where the actual transition of this person from a female to a male never took place, even though that's not possible because genetically you are still a female, but physically they didn't lop off or add parts. Now these next slides are the most interesting ones to me because it seems like there's an agenda taking place right before our eyes with the toxicology report. You'll notice the main page just shows the lab that it came from, and it talks about that positive findings, none were detected. Next page, however, shows what they tested for. Now this is really important that we recognize what they tested for. This is not a test of every single thing that would pop up in the system. This is a specific test for specific things that they are specifically looking for. In other words, let's say you bring in pool water to a pool store. You have chemicals that you put into the pool water that react a certain way to tell you what the parts per million is of that particular thing that you're looking for. Maybe you're measuring muriatic acid, or cyanuric acid. Maybe you're measuring chlorine. Well, if you don't put the specific thing that you're looking for that will react a certain way with that particular chemical, it doesn't matter what's in the water. If you didn't test for it, it's not going to show up on the report. This report seems to glaringly leave out some of the more popular things that I would be looking for, things that I have pointed out in my very own book about mass shooters. So let's real quickly go down the list of things that they did analyze for. The first one, amphetamines. That's essentially Adderall. They're testing this person to see if they took Adderall. Adderall is one of the most popular ADHD medications out there. They make billions of dollars a year off of Adderall. And it does show, surprisingly, I was surprised at this actually, that there is no Adderall in the system. I assumed Adderall is so commonly used. I assumed it would have been in here, but it was not. Next up was barbiturates and benzodiazepines. A little hard for me to say, but they're essentially calming drugs, drugs that will kind of chill you out. Next up is buprenorphine. That's essentially a pain medicine. You can abuse these pain medications out there, and that's one of them that it can be abused. Obviously, cannabinoids, that's marijuana. Cocaine, you know what that is. Fentanyl, obviously, you know what that is. Methadone, that's essentially a heroin withdrawal drug. Supposedly, heroin addicts can never, ever get completely off of it, so they give them methadone to take the place of heroin, but it's essentially like heroin. Methamphetamine, obviously, that's meth. Opiates, oxycodone, you know what those are. Pain-killing medications and things like that that are abused quite often on the street. The last one, phencyclidine, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that. That's essentially PCP. That's what they were looking for. I found it remarkably odd that there were no SSRIs on here. What do you mean by that? Well, I have quite a bit of my book dedicated to that, because SSRIs are the worst of the worst for these types of people that are being treated for the symptoms that this person had, depression, anxiety, things like that. I typed into Google, what are the most common psychotherapeutic drugs, thinking that some of the 12 that they listed might be on this list. Although there are some drugs like the 12 that they looked at on this list, none of the most popular drugs that are prescribed out there were tested for in this person. Not one of the drugs. This is from a 2020 list of the 25 psychiatric medications that are the most popular ones prescribed. And they did not test for a single one of these. Not one. So if you go look for what are the most dangerous psychotherapeutic drugs, the things that you're going to find out is they're SSRIs. SSRIs, again, I have almost an entire chapter devoted to this in my book, How to Make a Monster. They are the main source of drugs that are used to treat a lot of the anxiety, depression, and things like that. But they all have black box warnings. Black box warnings, you might ask. What is that? In October of 2004, the Federal Drug Administration issued a black box label warning indicating that the use of certain antidepressants to treat major depressive disorder in adolescents may increase the risk of suicidal ideations and behaviors. Okay, I'm going to come down here, not to bore you guys with a bunch of medical terms. Further down in the article, it states that one significant difference between the FDA study and that of the MHRA was that the FDA conducted an independent reclassification of suicidality. Since the original trials did not explicitly study the connection between SSRIs and suicidal behaviors, the FDA was concerned that the data did not use consistent measurements of suicidality across trials. A group of 10 pediatric suicidologists, I didn't know there was such a thing, organized by Columbia University, led an independent and blind reclassification. The conclusion of this meta-analysis using the reclassified data was that the use of all antidepressants increased the risk of suicidality among pediatric patients with MDD. Remember, MDD was the major depressive disorder. And it says, I quote, as a result, the FDA issued a black box warning for the 9 antidepressants. Cytopram. I'm not going to read all these because you probably recognize the street name or the prescription name of a lot of these. Celexa, Luvox, Paxil, Prozac, Zoloft, Effexor. I don't recognize those necessarily. But as you can see, very popular drugs, and none of these were tested for. None of these. These are all black box warnings, and these are part of some of those most popular drugs that are being prescribed. None of these were tested for. These are some of the things you will find that are associated with these black box warnings. You should be aware that when you're first starting an antidepressant, you may experience a temporary worsening of your depression. There you go. You're going backwards when you take it for depression. And potentially even increased thoughts of suicide. Studies indicate that this may be especially true for people younger than age 25. This shooter was, I believe, 25. Also, mania. This is one of the main ones. In people with bipolar disorder, which clearly this person had gender dysphoria did not know what gender they were or pretended to be another, so it's very possible they had something similar to a bipolar disorder, thinking they had another personality, clearly. Antidepressants can potentially trigger an episode of mania, especially if used without a mood-stabilizing drug. Symptoms of mania include increased energy and activity, problems with sleeping, racing thoughts, impulsive behavior, grandiose thinking, extreme elevation of mood, irritability, and pressured speech. Friends, I'm one of those people that says sometimes when something's not there, there's still something there. I don't understand why they chose, and maybe they have a good reason for this, but I don't understand why they chose 16 of the least popular drugs that people are taking for all of these mood altering things that they're trying to alter in their own moods. They picked some of the least popular. Now, granted, a lot of what they picked also were abused drugs. They were trying to see if this person was abusing some of the more common drugs. So I get that. In many cases, they weren't really looking, and you can probably fill in the blanks and understand why, but they weren't looking for any of these more than likely legally prescribed drugs. They were looking for drugs that are abused on the street, maybe purchased illegally, or at least abused from people who have prescriptions and are selling them illegally to other people. My point is, they weren't really looking for the whole picture. They were simply trying to identify, was this person abusing particular drugs that are commonly abused? They weren't looking for all the other drugs that this person is more than likely on. My guess is if they did any other toxicology reports of any kind and looked for additional drugs that would have sent this person into a suicidal rage or mania or homicidal thoughts, it's very likely those drugs would very quickly pop up on this test. Let's not forget that the pharmaceutical companies are one of the biggest profiteers of the mental illness that happens. Whether it is something that is not really a mental illness and they simply prescribe for it to make money, billions of dollars worth of money, or if it's something that really is prescribed to help somebody. There are millions of people in the United States who are prescribed these same mood-altering drugs, which in fact do have black box warnings, where these drugs help them out. I want to make that very clear. I want to repeat that. Millions of people every day benefit from the good effects of these drugs. But every drug has an effect and a side effect. And I can promise you that the FDA did not want to put a black box warning on these drugs. And I can promise you they were lobbied heavily by the pharmaceutical industry not to put a black box warning on their drugs. It's little ironic that some of the most popular drugs in the United States for these types of issues like depression, anxiety, and whatnot happen to be the ones that also have the worst side effects. Yet we did not test for those in this particular study. You tell me who's pushing the buttons out there. This has Big Pharma written all over it.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America.